the Grey Hat Beard podcast. Hello and welcome to Grey Hat Beard Princess, the modern workplace podcast where we talk about all things Microsoft 365. This is part 2 of show 56. If you haven't listened to part 1, go back and listen. We covered all the exciting news of Viva Goals. We covered the Ability Summit. I got distracted there because now I haven't chatted about this. It's going to be a very rambling one, but there was a fantastic news today of the first openly gay professional footballer in the UK for 30 years. So I just love that he's had the confidence to be able to come out. My wife sadly was reading the Mail online, and on there it made a typo of saying last season he managed to get 30 girls instead of 30 goals, which is put, now every time I see Viva Goals I'm now thinking Viva Girls, just to really confuse me. But anyway, let's move on from that quickly. Lovely typo from the Daily Mail, thank you for that one. We are joined by guests, so we do have the Grey Hat, the Beard today. Sadly, the Princess isn't with us with this one, but we do have a guest, Luke Evans, and he's going to be talking to us about infrastructure as code with Microsoft 365. But we probably need to start, for those listening, Luke, what is infrastructure as code?
Okay, all right. Let's take it down and kind of boil it down to the most simple kind of explanation. So it's a way of defining infrastructure as a configuration file. It's probably the most simplest way of putting it. Yeah. So it's the ability to have a file that defines your configuration. So spelling it out in a piece of code, as it were, or declarative language. You know, I want to provision, a SharePoint site. I want to provision a server. It's a way of defining it through a piece of code or a configuration file. It is the most simplest way I would probably put it. Now,
so if you've come from like a coded view, whether it's Amazon or Azure, you've got things like ARM, the Azure Resource Manager, and Bicep. You've got
and then you've got Terraform. If you want to go
Terraform,
for Terraform's multi-platform for cloud agnostic is the idea there. Then I think on top of that, a lot of the stuff I mess around with outside of Microsoft technologies, I use a lot of open source projects for my home. One of the key ones I use there is Ansible. So that's kind of configuration management. Again, infrastructure as code. I'm defining what I want my end state to be and then applying that using the files. Now, to me, it's incredibly powerful. There's so many reasons you probably want to go for it, but yeah.
And if you think, I know many of us have been back in the day of, right, we need to build a new website, right, I need to go and buy a new server, we need to get it racked up in the data center, we then need to log on, there's probably like a 30-page document. Now you've got a kind of configuration file, you click a button, it's up in the cloud somewhere random in the world you don't know about, and boom, it's done. And that's the power, isn't it?
Well, the power, I think, in my mind is, look, you used to sit there, you used to click through buttons, you used to, you had the wizard. You're really going to get that faster speed of deployment, like you mentioned. You're going to get the consistency. You're going to basically, it's going to make it a repeatable process is the thing. You can make it so that's one of the key things. I have server A over here. I have server B over here. We know there's not some guy clicking a wizard and applying those settings manually.
Or girl.
Guy or they or them.
Thank you.
It doesn't matter who clicks it. Really is the important thing. It doesn't matter. We're not relying on them to click on the right buttons is the important thing. We have drop downs, we have checkboxes, we have radio buttons. They may check a multitude of things. They may make a typo. The idea there for me is really the consistency and repeatability of it.
I just want to highlight consistency there as a there's lots of great things there, but consistency for me is from experience, right? And from being on projects in the past where, let's say I'm building something on SharePoint and it's SharePoint on-prem. And I have you have four servers, potentially 4 environments that you need to go through. You need to go through dev, into test, into integration, into prod, right? And if you have that drift across all those different 4 environments, you can suddenly start banging your head against the virtual brick wall, if you like, because
it works on my machine.
Exactly, the configuration's subtly different. You're investigating issues on one environment because it's configured slightly different to another environment. You don't have that consistency. So, from me as a developer point of view, it's incredibly frustrating when it works on my machine, it works on this environment, why doesn't it work on these other environments? And I think in some cases when you're in that kind of point and click and kind of wizard approaches, is it's very, very easy to make a mistake, but it's going to take you a lot of time to figure out what has caused it, right? Because you've got a whole host of changes that you then have to go and recheck, right? So I think, from a real world example, infrastructure as code really helps stop those issues from happening, which we definitely had
reduce, let's say.
Reduce.
But also, the other thing I would add to what Gary's saying is the ability to troubleshoot these things is significantly easier.
Yeah.
When you're dealing with infrastructure as code, typically, you're working with a version control system of some shape or form. Typically, GitHub, Azure DevOps, whichever you want, it's typically a Git repo is where we're going to store our files. And the key there is the ability just to look at basically what you've checked in. What is the different kind of what is the difference between those files? We're only looking at a piece of text in a file. We can quickly and easily see what's changed between basically different versions, and we can easily identify, hey, Al was a bit naughty. He had a typo here, and we can quickly and easily remedy that one. We can see immediately. It's going to flag that up when you start looking through the Git history really and see what has changed. And again, you're going to reduce risk by doing it this way. It is another way of looking at it. There's minimization of risk because when we're deploying, we can see exactly what are the values we're changing and what we're applying at that point. On top of that, another one that I would probably give it is once we start deploying with infrastructure as code, we can start establishing kind of, I would say I think it's time to delivery is going to be shorter. In all reality, you're not going to be sat there clicking wizards. You're not going to be entering values manually. The idea is that we can apply it to dev. We can then use an Azure DevOps pipeline, GitHub Actions, and we can apply that to, say, test. Then maybe pre-prod if you have that, and then we could go through an approval gate using a pipeline. And we can quickly and easily have someone verify and check, hey, dev, test, pre-prod, they all look great. We've applied this change. Now we can have an approval gate and someone can click yay or nay. So you can quickly and rapidly roll through that. And imagine each time you're going to do a release or a deployment, the amount of time you're going to save once that pipeline's in place is going to be crazy. Because I know
it's probably worth saying you might spend more time up front building up that config file and things like that, but then the total time you'd save very quickly manufacture that. I think that can often put people off that kind of time to create those initial templates and definition when it comes to kind of standard environments. But
I'll be honest,
absolutely worth it over the long run.
We had previously had Azure DevOps. We had like the point and click pipeline builder. We've moved to YML now, which is much closer to GitHub kind of actions. So it is getting more standardized. I think the initial typical learning curve is the challenge is how you want to approach this. Certainly when a new language came out, so I did a bicep pipeline very recently, maybe last 3-4 months, to deploy some Azure resources using that. And to be honest, there was not a great deal out there. But once it was set up, once it was working, the great thing is I could go absolutely to town on my configuration because I knew the pipeline was solid. I could just go, start renaming objects, do whatever I want, and basically just keep pushing that pipeline. And I would have dreaded to think, because every time I would have done that, probably I would have downloaded my bicep file, I'd have compiled it to ARM, I would have applied it to Azure, and you'd probably have to write some code to do that repeatedly is the thing. So yeah, I think you're right about the initial investment, but to me, it's an easy win. Once you get your head around pipelines, GitHub Actions, whatever it may be, whatever you want to choose to be your kind of tooling, then it is so much easier. So
we've thrown a lot of kind of technical elements in there, talking about bicep and ARM and things like that. They're all effectively ways to configure. None of us have biceps, it's fine.
We're nerds
on there. That's for those that don't know, that's a lot about deploying things, especially into Azure, and deploying the elements there. Now, hopefully you're not putting SharePoint on premises in Azure. Nothing entirely wrong with that, but it's kind of painful. One of the joys of the clouds and SharePoint Online is you don't have any infrastructure. So it's all managed by Microsoft. So how can you have infrastructure as code for SharePoint Online and Microsoft 365?
Okay, great question. But to me, there's elements of separation here. We have the platform, which is at the MS level, when we're talking about, IaaS, SaaS, PaaS, whatever it may be. Microsoft are managing that underlying platform. They give us something to work from. And on that SharePoint Online, there's a tenancy which has settings to configure. It has policies to configure. How do we want to share with people? How do we want to classify our information? That might be, wider compliance. How do we want to have notifications set up? Do we want everyone to be able to have a OneDrive? And so on and so forth. There's a whole bunch
external
of
sharing. Always a
you've
classic.
got it. There's a whole bunch of tenancy-wide kind of settings that we would typically configure and set up as part of any sort of onboarding to a SharePoint Online tenant is the thing. You might want to take the Microsoft defaults. You might want to go for the National Cybersecurity Center. Yeah, it may be that you spent some time cooking up, your own special formula of settings that you like for your tenant.
Just on that, Luke, so you talked about National Security Center. So that's the concept really of baselining, right? Of here are some defaults that are outside what Microsoft set up as part of the platform, where things may just be enabled for getting you on there and consumption and using the different tech, whereas actually this is taking a different approach and going, we've looked at the attack surface, if you like, if you want to call it that, and gone, here are some things that you want to start with, and you want to turn these things off and then look to enable them as and when you potentially need them, right?
And spot on. That is baselining. That is in effect what I'm talking about, because the nice thing, I think I'll talk about it a bit later, but I think the other part to this is you've got the platform level, which are kind of tenancy level settings and configuration. But on top of that, you may wish to manage kind of the elements that, content, as I'd probably describe it, as infrastructure as code as well. The thing is, typically when we come to a customer, and think about this when you're ready, because I'm sure this is a common scenario that you talk about, especially if you've got Louise on here as the one, because I know she does Provision Genie. I had a look at that. That's awesome. But I think the concept still applies behind the scenes. The same overall idea is there, is that you want to spin up a Microsoft team. You want to spin up a SharePoint site. You want a consistent, repeatable approach to how you're going to deploy those SharePoint sites. You want the same settings applied, because there is, and Microsoft's infinite wisdom, I would say, the sites, if you have certainly the external sharing guest access, you might want to change them depending on how your provisioning is set up within an organization. Yeah, it may be that you have a different set of settings for an external sharing site compared to, let's say, an internal site. You may want to apply a different theme or something. It's simple as that. Yeah, I want it to be read when it's an external sharing site, and you can start taking an infrastructure code approach to that as well as the thing. So Provisioning Genie, for example, that kind of handles it, because you're repeating that provisioning process every time and applying the same settings using a set series of code. But what we're abstracting it a layer further and saying these are the sites we want, and this is how we want them set up. So this is our desired state, as it were, or this is what we want it to look like, and we want that to appear in our tenancy. So it may be, again, you might not go, what would I say, whole hog, as I put it. You might not prescribe every site that you want to provision, but it may be that every tenancy you set up, you have, a default set of ones that you want to provision. You might want to
pathways.
Exactly, you've got it. So you can look at infrastructure and code from that view as well. It's not just tenancy level, but it may be content.
And there's a key scenario here that, if we think back to, 10 years ago when we were on-prem, if we wanted to test something, we would take a backup of a SharePoint database and we would restore it, and wow, it's all there. And we don't necessarily have that luxury, because, as you said, Kev,
assuming you test your backups. Yeah.
DBA, yes, of course, test your backups. But we don't have that capability now, and that gets a lot of clients when they're looking at how they test a new configuration. So making a change at a platform level actually now brings in a lot more risk. So you need to be the ability to be able to test that, and you need the ability to kind of replicate your production settings into a tenant in order to test some of those changes. So ideally, you do want to be able to say, can I just take a copy of my configuration and apply it somewhere else, provision some sites to test, and test the impact of making that change? And that's where this is a really powerful tool. The desired state, being able to take that snapshot of the configuration, apply it, or just see the differences, and then actually make changes, test them, and then roll back, and then make those changes again and test them. Yeah, code is really the only way those changes should be made.
So I'm really disappointed because two of you have mentioned desired state as if you were going to lead nicely onto the next thing without doing it. And I was like, this is a brilliant lead through. And then you didn't do it. So you've mentioned desired state. Luke, why have you and Al both mentioned desired state as specific words there?
Oh, gosh. Desired state. So desired state config. Al, you might want to take this. I don't have a great answer for desired state config, but I can tell you what I think it means, is what I would say. Yeah. It's kind of it's self-explanatory. It's what do you want your configuration to look like? Yeah. So to me,
it really is. If you think that every change that you make is a setting, and there are thousands of settings, if not tens of thousands of settings that we've discussed some of them, but it can be things like we're applying compliance labels, sensitivity labels, we're making tenant level changes. And we want to bring out those things that impact how users use the environment. Desired state means that we can actually benchmark that and go, okay, we have a set of configuration that we know we trust, and we want to be able to track if somebody makes a change to any of that. We want that to be flagged.
So sorry, for people listening, what is desired state?
Well, I mean, for me, desired
it's basically a config file.
It's really desired state is what do I want my configuration to look like, and it's a text file that details what I want my end state to look like. So the way I think about it is, we want our 365 tenancy to look a certain manner, like Al said, and we're going to apply that desired state. So it doesn't matter what state the tenancy is in at that point. We're going to apply our desired state, and it will become the state that we've defined. Now, that did sound like a bit of waffle, but I'm hopeful it kind of got there.
Leading question: are we talking about this being a tool, maybe a desired state for Microsoft 365?
But for Microsoft 365, DSC is a tool. It is a set of code that extracts those configuration settings, saves them, and then can reapply them or compare them.
Yeah.
So it's tooling that allows you to extract the configuration.
And that last bit's really important, that comparison as well, that you don't necessarily need to just apply. You can sort of see where the differences are as well. So you could generate reports. Gary, you were talking about that baselining. This is for Microsoft 365, probably, I don't know about the only, but quite possibly the only one I know of that allows you to do it that way.
There is another paid offering out there that I've actually spoken with the guys, Kevin. I think it's Simian Cloud is the one. And they do kind of an infrastructure as code approach, but it's a paid one, not like DSC is the one. Now, I think, what I was going to frame it up as is 365, and again, you guys feel free to stop me if you think I've got it wrong, but it's come from origins where we've kind of bolted a number of different products together. Yeah, you've got Exchange Online, you've got Teams, you've got SharePoint, you've got OneDrive, you've got the 365 tenancy itself, you've got the Security and Compliance Center, and to be as kind as possible, I don't think all the teams are working exactly the same way. We've ended up with I don't know how many different admin portals and how many different ways of applying settings using different PowerShell modules. Now, the real strength and depth for me for Microsoft 365 DSC,
it's all in the graph, isn't it?
Well,
all in the grass, the long graph.
Yeah.
The graph might well be the end state. Yeah, that might be Microsoft's desired state config, as it were. That's where they want to get to. But as it stands, I'm still using basic auth to manage Exchange Online in a number of scenarios. Now, I think where DSC really hits the nail on the head is it can combine those experiences together and help us extract configurations from across the whole tenancy and apply it in vice versa is probably the key. And that's really the key one for me, because we manage Intune, you use Graph, and you use some Intune PowerShell modules. You manage Azure AD, you might use the Azure AD module, which is going to be deprecated, but you might well go for Graph. It may be if you do an Exchange, you can do some stuff in Graph, but a lot of it you might fall back to Exchange modules. So it's that overarching piece that does it for me. The ability to bring it all together is really one of the strong selling points for DSC.
It abstracts away that mechanism of whatever it's calling, right? In 365, whatever API, you don't really care about that from a DSC perspective, because from the DSC perspective, you have that file, right? Here is my configuration, and here are the settings that I need to apply to this particular environment. I mean, DSC, so we're talking about Microsoft 365 DSC. DSC's been around for quite a while. I remember using it with SharePoint on-prem, the SQL modules as well. Again, just that kind of common configuration format that would run through kind of like a compilation process, and then the tool would take over the hard parts for you.
That format's PowerShell, isn't it?
It's the configuration is actually something called a MOF file that you use, which basically gets compiled and then applied through the DSC kind of framework, if you like, to your target environment. So back in the day, it was could be SharePoint or Windows Server or SQL Server. Now it's being applied to a platform, which is 365. So that. Coming back to it's a text file, right, is that there's the text file which is defined in that configuration, and you run it through this tool which is then doing the application, abstracting away all those calls that it might be calling graph, who cares, that's in the implementation, right? We don't need to get that low level, we just need to know that my exchange setting is going to get applied. But once you've got that configuration file, the other side of that DSC side is, from a compliance point of view, it has these checks, and you can set things up like Azure Automation has a DSC element to that, where you can basically set the Azure Automation service to check your configuration maybe every hour, and then decide, okay, if this is out of compliance, i.e. someone's come along and changed the setting in the user interface, what do we do about it? Do we switch it straight back and we just make the change, or do we flag it up and then we investigate? And that's that real power, I think, as well, is that we're getting that consistency of deployment and documenting exactly these settings to apply to new environments, but also keeping things in check, which is another real big benefit of DSC, I think, so that you can check the drift, if you like, of those settings, and that's the bit, right? It's great going through all those pipelines and doing all that effort to document it all, and then you have some admin that comes along and just goes, no, I don't like these, and I'm just going to change all these things, and you're like, okay, what did we have? And we need to go change them again. So yeah, that for me is a huge benefit of using DSC.
And we've talked a lot about kind of pipelines and PowerShell and exporting. I think it's worth noting, for those who can see on the screen, there is actually a web interface for Microsoft 365 DSC, so you can go and kind of pick all the different things. You can see down the left the kind of range of different things across Microsoft 365 that it covers. So, the security and compliance elements, even Power Platform, which I think is fairly recent. I haven't noticed that there before. But you've got those different areas of configuration that you can set up and generate the export for that. That text file, that what you call it, MOS file for it. MOF. Thank you.
Yep.
On there that comes out. So you don't have to understand that very detailed understanding. If you've come from PnP, that you get very massive XML files. There are ways you can do it more easily. I would kind of warn people not to tick too many things on the SharePoint side when they're doing this, because it can export every single site and the definition. I think 4 days is the longest I've seen one run before we gave up, and things on there. So it's worth planning a bit of time for that. But you don't have to get very, very detailed with the scripting straight away to kind of be able to see what's going on with that as well.
It's pick and choose the things that you need. There are certain limitations around DSC, so I think there's a file size limit as well that the framework can actually apply, and I think it's only 2 meg. So if you decide to turn everything on and you generate one huge big MOF file, it'll just go, no, you've documented it, great, but you'll need to split that up to then make sure that you can actually apply it to different environments.
I think the other thing to think about there is thinking about what you're going to use it for. How you actually going to use it. You don't want one massive file, because that's not necessarily going to be good for anyone, but you might be doing more changes around the Power Platform or more changes around SharePoint rather than Exchange, so you can kind of break it down and do a different rhythm of actually checking and updating it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
so that
no, you go for it, Kev. I was going to talk about some real world examples.
That's Microsoft 365 DSC. You mentioned, was it Simian as the paid one?
Simian Cloud is an interesting one. Yeah, so I spoke with the guys over in the States on this one, because I said, hey guys, I'm going to do a talk at Scottish Summit around DSC. I'm obviously scoping out the competitors that are out there, and they do have an offering. It's pretty good. In all honesty, they've kind of done their own DSC with baselines baked in. So they have, this is our baseline, and you can apply that to a tenant. Obviously, it's a costed offering, but it does look pretty darn cool, is the one. So I did try to angle for a demo, but like a demo tenant, but they wouldn't give me one. So that was a bit unfortunate. But I had a good show and tell on with them for about an hour. So that is probably the only other one I've seen in this space that really is kind of doing the same sort of thing. So they were an interesting.
And then
one.
I guess I'm intrigued because Al, you were talking about backups. I'm wondering some of those backup providers, whether they do anything. I think Veeam and others, or whether they just back up content.
Yeah. So when I'm saying backups, for testing, is transfer of that config.
Yeah.
It's making
I'm
sure
wondering if any of
config,
those providers would also back up config, or whether they're just content. I've never really tried, actually. It's interesting.
I've dealt with 2 of the backup providers so far. So I've got experience of Veeam, and also the AvePoint backup solutions are the ones that I played with. And they're only really concerned at the content level. They're not too interested in the configuration side. That they don't. It's really the content that you store within the platform that they're interested in. I can restore teams, I can restore groups, I can restore SharePoint sites. What I'm not going to go is go have a look at my admin settings that I had on the 26th of March 2022 or whatever it may be. I don't have that ability to scroll back in time. Certainly from they might have added it, but I haven't seen that is the one. Whereas these guys, so DSC or the Simian Cloud, will allow you to go and see this is what we had at that point in time, and let's go replay that or reset it to what it was.
And then I guess the other options, as you mentioned, there are APIs, there's PowerShell modules. If you don't need everything, there could be specific things that you could export and re-import with those. But
so I'll tell you one that's really great.
Painful.
You ready? So you could go do that, but I mean, I've seen a great use of the DSC module for a specific area, like you said, and that is I'm trying to remember the guy's name. I'm going to look him up on LinkedIn. Give me 1 second. Claus Jespersen, I think he's a conditional access.
Conditional access god.
The absolute god at conditional access. And he's got this repo, a GitHub repo on conditional access. And very recently, maybe 2-3 weeks ago, they did a DSC implementation of it. So you can pick up his conditional access rule-based and just apply that. So to me, that was awesome. I just think
that is an amazing use case, because if you mess up conditional access, you so want to have a button to undo.
Exactly, and can you imagine? And the amount of time, it's like a 50-page document of design that he's written around how he's built the rules, what it's structured. And to me, I'm an admin at the end of the end of the doc. Do I really care about the 50 pages? Just give me the best practice and let's get on with it, And you could just a couple of clicks and away you go. You can get it up and running in your tenant, which is really the power to me, because creating conditional access rules, as fun as it is, it does take time, clicking through all the different settings and whatever you may want to apply, but they've done all the hard work for you. So I think for their one, they have 2 kind of ways of doing it. You provision your groups up front using a DSC, so you provision your groups, and then you provision after that, you provision the rules that target those groups. And to me, it's a fantastic use case. And I think one of the other ones I've come across real world is typically Intune is another painful one, is the thing. So you think about how many different settings there are to do as part of a device configuration profile. And, you make one change. And if I said to go find the change that Al made on the 30th of March or whatever it may be, I think you would struggle greatly, is the thing at the moment. It would be near impossible to find what he changed at any given point unless you have that kind of replayability in terms of infrastructure as code.
I've got that look on Al's face that says, no, any change I'd have documented.
Yeah.
All right, maybe we go. Maybe it's Kev that made the change then.
It's me. Yeah, that's far more likely.
So
you didn't need to laugh quite so much, both of you, but that's far more likely.
So maybe Kev made this change, but you might be able to find the profile he's made the change. But imagine it's a lengthy profile. Imagine it's some horrible WDAC one, Windows Defender Application Control. It's just a giant XML file that you're uploading. It's going to be very tricky to replay that and figure out what's changed.
I think this is it. It's the number of different things that are configured, are built, how you're managing Azure. There's all sorts of different things that you want to be able to track. And so long as there are APIs to pull that information out, ideally somebody's going to build a tool that's going to allow you to extract those configuration settings and to use this concept of using desired state configuration. Because I think, you know, there are lots of tools out there that will do similar things, but it just depends on what you actually need to actually track and to manage, and how you want to integrate it into whatever you're doing. So whether it's, you know, multiple M365 environments, a way to manage Azure AD or Conditional Access or Intune, there's a lot of different things that people would need to be able to track.
And I think also, following on from what Al said, I think another perfect use case is typically MSPs. So managed service provider, say you're managing 20, 30 tenants. Imagine you tell your admin, you know, this great feature's just come out. Luke Evans spoke about it on the Greybeard Princess podcast. It's this ownerless group policy. You know, how can I apply that to 30 tenants in one go? Yeah. And again, this is where code is king, really, because you could have some guy sat there, click it, or lady, whatever, person, click through, you know, apply it 30 times to all these different customer tenants. Or you could have one file that says, this is how we want to define the configuration, and these are the tenants we want to apply it to, and away you go. And then if you get really fancy, you may start building that, like we said, pipeline, so you can automate the application of that. So
and ensure it,
the consistency will be there. You know, whatever I've set in code, unless, you know, the application of it goes wrong with DSC, which we'll obviously see, it's going to be the same throughout, which is great, because I can imagine me clicking through those boxes, and, you know, I might set one for 4 weeks. I might accidentally click one at 5 weeks. And, you know, you might choose one which is all owners or certain groups. It's difficult when you're doing that many times over and over. How can we ensure that consistency from an MSP perspective?
Absolutely. You mentioned earlier, Luke, about content. So Microsoft 365 DSC wouldn't really touch content. Is that right?
What I'm talking about is content elements. So the way I see it, maybe it's more a building block, whatever you want to call it.
But you could build in PnP provisioning to kind of help you with quite a lot of content. I know there's some limitations, but for most parts.
Well, I mean, you're taking it to the next level there, Kev. You're really leveling up, as it were, because, you know, we've got DSC. You could build up, you know, a site, but then at that point, you probably would want to say, hey, if you want to do something really funky, maybe we'll do some PnP provisioning templates and use those. But I was thinking more the building blocks. You know, you're going to want a site that might be for, like you said, learning pathways. You may want one to store your information security policy. It may be you want to, you know, there's ones that probably you'd have everywhere as the important thing. Whatever you're doing, you probably have some consistent ones across there that you could probably bake into your baselines, as it were. But yeah, I wouldn't get down and dirty too much. But that's SharePoint for conditional access, for example.
But as you say, with those MSPs, if you wanted a kind of common look to sites, and you say common sites, then build in PnP provisioning, you can again have it as part of your deployment pipeline, run the DSC, set the config, deploy a lot of your content with that, boom, done.
You'd be rocking and rolling, absolutely, yeah. You know, and that's just taking it even further beyond. You know, you're powering up. It's too extreme for me, Kev. It's
it's too low level.
But no, I take your point, and yeah, I think for me, once you reach a certain point on DSC, it might be, you know, there's better tools for the job, like PnP for SharePoint.
And I was going to say, and this is an open question, so I'm not putting Luke on the spot on this one, but what are the limitations on DSC? I think Al or Gary, you talked about the kind of 2 meg file size and things. And I know when I've run it and ticked too many things, it can sort of chug away for a long time. Are there any things you shouldn't do with it?
I think I guess it's a limitation, but there's no harm in breaking things up and not having one huge file. Just think about, you know, in your organization, you may have one person that does a lot of different roles, but actually as you're scaling up, then, you know, you'll still have people who look after Exchange. So Exchange people will own that bit of configuration, but use the same system as, say, a Power Platform admin, who then might use their own configuration. So splitting it up is not necessarily a bad idea anyway. And yeah, it might sound like it's working around a limitation, but actually there's a benefit of doing that as well. And, you know, so you haven't got all of your changes in that one file. But I think in terms of the limitations, I mean, you are still limited by the APIs that are available. So we've talked about, well, you could call the graph, right? Yeah. If there's an endpoint in the graph, or if there's something in the Exchange APIs or SharePoint APIs that can achieve what you want. And I think
and the time it takes from new APIs and having being open source, catching up with that to a certain degree as well. Yeah, that's a really good point.
Exactly. So there's not everything that becomes available has an immediate API that allows you to manage it, right? It's not always the case. So there's going to be those edge cases that you might not be able to cover. So I think you kind of need to keep that in mind. But again, if you've got edge cases, that's better than your whole tenant, right? Of trying to deal with that configuration. So I think those are the kind of limitations that I think are what everyone faces with a platform like 365. It's not just you're using this particular tool. All the tools that we use and we build are all still using those APIs in the background that are made available to us by Microsoft. So yeah, we're kind of limited by that.
The other ones I've seen is just the fact, I know you put this in the chat, so I'm going to call you out, Gary. You mentioned the MOF file. I think the way it exports is to a PowerShell file. It's not the simplest file, having come from kind of JSON config worlds and XML config, do it in PowerShell. It can be add a layer of complexity that people might not like. So I think that is something. It's not a simple thing, but.
Yeah, I think it's right, but I think it's for me it's still the right format for the audience, if that makes sense. Because I know Luke has been talking about, we've talked about Git repositories and all that kind of things. You're thinking, okay, is this a developer thing then? Well, no, it isn't a developer thing. It's still administration, right? But actually, now the tools that developers would have used in the past, like Git repositories,
we're all developers now.
Exactly. It's a skill that is ubiquitous, whether you are an admin or whether you're a developer now. It's a core skill that you need to learn when you're managing code, whether that is JavaScript or whether that is C# or whether that is PowerShell. In the case of DSC, it's something that you need to be able to manage and track the history of, and have those that approach of checking into a centralized repository and then having checks and balances that run off the back of that with GitHub Actions and pipelines and all that good stuff. So I think it makes sense being PowerShell. Otherwise you'd probably do it in Bash and then you're in another world.
Well, I think that the other thing for me, one of the things that has always scared me about M365 DSC was DSC. They didn't really say a great deal for a while. It went kind of quiet after, I think it was like I can't remember which version of DSC came out, but they kind of went a bit quiet. I'm not really sure where DSC is going in the future. They seem to think that they did DSC 1, whatever it was based on for Windows machines, and then they said they're moving to more cross-platform. But I'll be honest, they haven't been the most responsive or the most, I would say, communicative teams out there from Microsoft. I don't really know what the long-term future vision of DSC is. That's a wider one, not just the 365 DSC. I'm talking about DSC as a whole. So that one, and I think the other one, I remember speaking with some guys that just said DSC was inherently slow in comparison to some other tools and technologies like Ansible or ones out there. I don't think it's the quickest in applying the changes.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I think I'm always amazed every time I look at it. Why aren't more people using this? And I think there are certain technical challenges to people knowing all those processes that versus most Microsoft 365 admins. They know the admin center, they know all the details there, they know where to go and click things. They're not often naturally kind of PowerShell based.
I think it comes back to the, what are the APIs that are available?
Mm-hmm.
If you think about, how much we've been able to do with PowerShell and how that's grown over the time, there's a certain amount that you need to have available in order to make it effective. Otherwise, you kind of go, oh, well, it's done all of that, but not this thing over here and that thing over there. So I think, you do need a kind of a baseline of you're covering most of the capabilities that are most in need for this purpose. And I think there's a lot there. Teams in PowerShell, only 2 years ago I remember trying to do Teams in PowerShell and having to use the Teams PowerShell module for some things, AD for other things, Exchange for other things,
or whatever it was.
Yeah, and you had a lot of different different ways into those configuration settings. So the more it becomes standardized and the more that are made available, the more likely that DSC will be a mature product that you can actually trust and use to cover off what you actually are expecting it to be able to do.
Yeah, I think, Luke, you make a good point about not just Microsoft 365 DSC, but DSC as a technology. In the, I remember, Ryan Yates, the MVP PowerShell, talking about DSC years ago, and I remember him talking about it and going, "This is amazing," and the same, Kev. It's kind of like we're talking about it again. It's like, oh, this is really good, and it's been around for a long time, but it's not really been talked about, and it's not the most intuitive to get into. It's not straightforward. Once you've got it, oh yeah, this looks simple, but there is a bit of a learning curve there, and I think there's a whole number of maybe those challenges to get over. The not all organizations are maybe thinking with infrastructure as code, maybe more now with the rise of DevOps and more admin focused roles, looking at more of the dev tools like using source control and things like that, which is, there's all those things that you need to factor in, but maybe it's time again for DSC to try and make its way forward. I think you mentioned about Windows only as well. I think that's been another thing. PowerShell 7, I think in the early versions it wasn't in there, and now I think it's starting to get some traction in the cross platform.
Sorry, just confirm, it's still Windows only, is it? Or
no, it was.
I think 7.2 they said that they're making inroads into basically having it as a cross-platform functionality. Because to me, when I use PowerShell, I'm typically working in you got Windows PowerShell, which is 5. You got PowerShell, as it's called, or used to be PowerShell Core 6. You got PowerShell. I want to be able to pick that up on a Unix system, on a Mac OS system, or on a Windows system. I want to be able to run that code and repeat it. So that for me is one of the strengths of PowerShell. So you really want that DSC, the same experience really, because to me, if I'm going to go configure configure an Ubuntu system, I'm going to use Ansible. If I'm going to configure a Windows system, I probably wouldn't use Ansible, because I'll probably go use DSC is the one. So if we could have that consistent experience across all of them, then so much the better. If I can DSC that, but it's got a way to go, is what I would say. There's quite a hill to climb.
I think it's probably about time we wrap up and finish up there. I hope people listening have got this far with us. I know we've gone through some relatively deep technical stuff on this on there, but I hopefully have got here, because I think the Microsoft 365 DSC is worth investing that time and looking in. If you want to find out more about what you can do with infrastructure code, get yourself up to the Scottish Summit and listen to Luke speak there. I'm sure he will very soon be announcing some more places that he will be speaking about that. So keep an eye out on Luke's LinkedIn and Twitter. I'll put those into the show notes if that's all right with you, and get people to get in contact. But yeah, really, I think thinking about how you can configure your environments, I think the parting word, Gary, was you with consistency. Why would you do this? To get consistency between your environments, between your own environment, knowing that someone's not going to have a quick fiddle and try something out and break everything. You've got that rollback. You've got that consistency to do it. That's why you should be looking at things like this, because the configuration can be defined like that for the most part. Be aware of where those limitations are that we've talked about, but for the most part you're going to get that consistency throughout, and that's really what an IT pro wants. They want a nice stable environment that's not going to break anything, that keeps people happy. So that's what you get.
That's what a business wants as well.
That's what a business.
Let's not worry about the IT pro. It's what the business wants.
Absolutely. So no, that was really interesting. Thank you, Luke. And,
cool. What I would say is thanks for having us. It's very, very much appreciative having me on here. Like you said, my handle on LinkedIn and Twitter is Luke Evans Tech. You can find me there. It's also GitHub, Reddit, whatever you want. I think I've grabbed that one in a number of places. So feel free to ping me there if you want to learn some more. Or
do we find you on TikTok at all? Or
You know what? I've actually seen some MVPs on TikTok, and it's not for me. I'll just put it there. I'll put it out
Are
there.
they dancing? Is that right?
It's not for me. I read the breakdown of kind of what that app had, and I was not in. I couldn't run further away from that app. So yeah, again, big thanks to having me. Yeah, much appreciated. And I hope we didn't go too far into the weeds and the depths. I think we covered a lot of ground there. So yeah, fantastic.
I think it's great. Well, thank you very much. Do listen out. We have another guest coming out next week. And this is one of those moments where I know the name and I've suddenly realised I've never said it out loud. But we'll have Thomas Posterek. I think that's how. I think I've butchered that entirely.
Kev.
Yeah.
Sorry, Thomas.
Yeah, I apologise hugely, and hopefully you're not listening to this bit, and you can tell us how to say your name properly next time. One day I will learn to think about how names are spelt before I try and say them. On there as well. So do listen out, and we've got some guests coming up. We will be putting out tweets, so we're on still at Grey Hat Beards. If you search Grey Hat Beard Princess on Twitter, we're going to be putting out a call for more speakers as well. So we've got quite a few lined up. But basically, I'm really bad at organising. So the further ahead we can get people booked in, the less likely I am to get to a kind of Sunday night and go, oh, we haven't got a guest for tomorrow. So hopefully we can get more people in for that one. So do keep an ear out for that. Otherwise, thank you very much again, Luke, and we will see you all next week. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to Grey Hat Beard Podcast. The song Drink Up My Mateys was brought to you by Black Bones under a non-commercial attribution license.